All right, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the final session of iStand 2020. This closing session is on global obstacles and opportunities in the New World Order. And this final closing session, we're very pleased to bring both Eugene Casey, a former FBI agent, and Al Friso, a diplomat. Alf is a father of an abducted and now alienated child, Henrik. And Eugene Casey, this is his second time joining us. Thank you so much for coming back. So this final session, I first want to start and bring Eugene and Alf up to speed because all day long we've been talking about how we re-engineer this movement, how we create a new opportunities, especially in this COVID pandemic era. How do we overcome the traditional barriers that we've had and these new barriers that we have to reunite with our children and to reform the issue of international parental child abduction? And so our goal for this session today, and we're also joined by Paul Tolan. Thank you so much, Paul. Paul is also a parent of Jessica?
Erica.
I'm sorry, Erica.
That's good.
Pardon me.
No,
Erica,
that's good.
Erica Tolan. And so before I turn it over to them, and we're just going to start with Eugene and then let Alf make his opening comments and then Paul's opening comments, I would just like to make a few observations. So over the course of the past 2 days, we've been talking about how do we overcome the current context and the historical problems that we have had with both institutions and the general public in terms of awareness and understanding of the gravity, the severity, and the profound impact of international parental kidnapping, international parental child abduction. How do we take all of that and transform that into a new movement to end international parental child abduction and return America's stolen children home? And globally, how do we combat the pernicious problem of IPCA? And so Alf and Eugene, I'd just like to tell you that over the course of today and yesterday, that's the direction that we've been going in. We've talked about the new realities of COVID, and not only is it an obstacle, but it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to embrace new technologies and new ways to overcome these traditional barriers. We've also talked about some of the longstanding failures that we've had among institutions, the Hague, the Goldman Act, and the piecemeal and fragmented responses that we've had from institutions and individuals who are charged with this. And so now in this closing session, I would invite you all to share your personal perspectives and your overarching perspectives of what are the barriers and the challenges that we have, and what are the opportunities for us to overcome them. And so, Eugene, if we might start with you, we would welcome you and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Dr. Hunter. My pleasure to be with you again, and appreciate the opportunity. Again, my name is Eugene Casey. I was an FBI agent for 21 years. And I'm not speaking on behalf of the FBI because I'm no longer with the FBI. So I'm just offering my own personal opinions based on my experience with these types of investigations. And I just want to give you my advice if I were in your shoes. And some of these things may sound pretty basic, but I think I've experienced people who weren't aware of certain facts, and I just want to help you get started with involving an entity like the FBI, which even with COVID, obviously there are essential workers, and the police and the FBI and the prosecutors are still working just as they always do. Same with our FBI agents overseas. If you allow screen sharing, I can show you a presentation. I don't know if anyone can do that for me. While we're working on screen sharing, I'll just go ahead and get started with some tips. Obviously, the first thing you're going to do if your child's abducted, you're going to call the local police, and then if it involves the abducting parent traveling internationally right off the bat, you also want to involve the State Department immediately. And the number to call is their Office of Children's Issues, and their phone number is 888-407-4747. And then what I recommend you do for ease of involving the police and the FBI is to document all of this on a fact sheet, the basic facts of your case. And what I would do is write down the basic facts for any investigator, such as when was custody awarded, by what jurisdiction. I would provide copies of court orders and exactly how and when the other parent violated the custody order, a copy of the child's passport if you have that, a full ID of both parents, clearly labeling yourself as the victim parent and the other as the abducting parent. And you want to include their date of birth, social security numbers, passport numbers, nationality, any known phone numbers, email addresses, overseas addresses, any known relatives overseas and their addresses, credit card and bank information of the abducting parent. Okay, I just emailed it, so hopefully you'll get it shortly.
Thank you.
Okay, so in the meanwhile, I will continue. I recommend you preserve all evidence of their intent to abduct and to flee. And that could be voicemails, it could be emails and documents such as credit card receipts for airfare, etc. Then you want to start familiarizing yourself with the law, including the civil law, the Hague Convention on the Civil Aspects of Child Abduction. And I think there's a very good summary on Wikipedia of that convention. There we go. Okay, I'm on the second slide. Yeah, so I'm on the second bullet point right there. Once you familiarize yourself with the Hague Convention, and then hopefully by then the local police have obtained an arrest warrant, and the abducting parent and child, if they're then overseas, now you're ready to contact and involve the DOJ, Department of Justice, and the FBI. And even before you do that, you might want to familiarize yourself with the relevant federal statutes that the FBI and the DOJ need to help you. And the three statutes that are going to be most important in these types of cases are what we call a UFAP, or the unlawful flight to avoid prosecution, which will sort of piggyback off the local charge and enable us, the FBI, to do what it needs to do overseas. The other statutes you want to be familiar with are the International Parental Kidnapping Statute, Title 18, Section 1204, and the Parental Kidnapping Prevention Act. Next slide. And if you have questions, I know Dr. Hunter can get you copies of this very short presentation. And then you're ready to report it to the FBI, and you would report it to the local FBI office wherever you live. And you can find that out by going to their website, fbi.gov. And then it's really helpful if you have that fact sheet ready to go and include how your case has federal jurisdiction, citing those statutes I just mentioned on the previous slide. And that first sentence of your communication with the FBI should say, you're reporting an international parental child abduction and you're requesting immediate contact from the local FBI's Violent Crime Squad. You don't want to contact the FBI in the country where the child is. You want to contact where you live, the local FBI office in the United States where you live, because they will be the conduit to the FBI overseas. But it has to start in wherever your local jurisdiction is. Now, sometimes the FBI may not respond, and I've seen this myself, because we're only, if you think about it, we're about 13,000 FBI agents across the whole United States and the world. And just to compare that to the NYPD, they have over 36,000 uniformed officers. So the FBI is 1/3 the size of the New York City Police Department, and we cover the whole country and the whole world. So the FBI obviously has to have priorities, and they can't investigate every case. So what will increase your odds of the FBI helping you is if you do what I recommend and have this fact sheet ready to go. Make it easy for them, make it simple for them, and don't give them any excuse not to help you. So I would put it, document in a fact sheet like that. And if for some reason the local FBI office, you're having trouble getting them on board, go to the local federal prosecutor's office. That's Department of Justice, the U.S. Attorney's Office, and you can find out their location and contact information at justice.gov. And again, ask to speak to a violent crimes prosecutor and send them your fact sheet. And if neither one of those work and you're still having trouble getting DOJ or the FBI on board, I recommend you contact your 3 congressional representatives, whoever your congressperson is in the House of Representatives, and your 2 senators, and specifically ask that they contact the DOJ and FBI on your behalf. And last slide. So what happens is once the local FBI is involved and they're on board, they will contact the FBI in the destination country. And that office of the FBI overseas in an embassy is called the legat office. And the legat will then seek a local arrest warrant, or what they call a provisional arrest warrant, or a PAW, for the parent who abducted the child. And then the State Department separately will request the return of the child via the Hague Convention, which is a civil procedure. So the FBI will handle the criminal part of it. The State Department handles the civil part of it. And at this point, when you engage in a civil proceeding in another country, I highly recommend you get a local attorney in that country. And one way to get a list of recommended attorneys is by contacting the US Embassy in that country and asking for American Citizen Services. And you can look them up where they are through the State Department website at state.gov. And you can ask for local attorneys who speak English, who specialize in this type of matter. And I've worked with people before, and this has been an extremely helpful tool. Then what happens is the FBI will ask the local police to go ahead and arrest that abducting parent if that's possible in that country. It depends on the country. There has to be something called dual criminality in both countries for that to happen. But even if that can't happen, the Hague Convention can still go forward if that country is a signatory to the convention, and they can put the child in local protective custody. They're not going to give the child to you. It's going to go to a local protective service while the matter is judged by a local civil judge in that country. And then if an arrest warrant is obtained for the abducting parent, the FBI will then attempt to extradite that person if there's an extradition treaty between those 2 countries. And I can tell you that if let's say it's in France and the person is a French national, almost no country will extradite nationals of their own. So that's just not going to happen. So just to help you gauge your expectations. But what many of these countries do, they have a mutual legal assistance treaty with us. And what they will do in lieu of that, they will actually put on a local trial if there are appropriate criminal charges for the abducting parent in that country. And my last bit of advice here is do not hire individuals who claim they can get your child back for you. And what they're really doing is re-kidnapping them from an overseas location. And what they're really doing is involving you in illegal activity, and they're going to take all your money. And I just advise you stay away from these people and do it by the book. And it's a slow, frustrating process, but that's my advice. And I'm happy to answer questions after the next speaker.
Thank you, Eugene. Thank you for your patience as we got your slides up as well. Alf, I wanted to turn to you next, and I'd like to let you know that, so the article that you just published both on your personal experience with Henrik and then also your experiences with the Hague Convention are in all of the conference participants packets, and we will also be making that available online. So Alf, we would invite you to share with us your perspective on obstacles and opportunities in the New World Order.
Thank you, Noelle. It's nice to see you again after all this time. Oh. I really wish that I had been able to be in Washington, and my wife and I would have definitely come if it hadn't been for this crazy pandemic. I managed to watch a couple of segments earlier today, particularly the one with on the Goldman Act with Jamil Zaoui, which I thought was really interesting. Questions about where central authority should be located, whether State Department or Justice Department. Those are things that I would very much would have liked to have discussed if I'd been present. So my name is Alf Friso. I'm a Norwegian American. I was born in the US. I grew up in Colorado. I have my undergraduate degree from the University of Colorado. My parents are Norwegian, and I ended up going back to Norway, and I've always been interested in international affairs. So I ended up in the Norwegian Foreign Service. So I've been a diplomat for the past 27 years. And right now I'm working at the Norwegian Embassy in Pretoria, South Africa, where I am now. I'm a parent. My son, Henrik, was abducted by his mother in April of 2013 from Norway to Nicaragua. It was completely unexpected. They were going for 2 weeks. My ex-wife claimed her mother, the grandmother, was sick, which I know is an excuse. I've heard that someplace else today. It's a long story, but I started the Hague process through the Norwegian Central Authority, the Justice Ministry. Let's get my son returned. I was very hopeful to begin with because it was an open and shut case in my mind. Nicaragua and Norway had partnered with each other under the Hague Convention. And, you know, it took months and I was very patient. Nothing happened, but suddenly there was a decision that my son would not be sent home. And it's, anybody who reads my article, you'll read some of the crazy arguments that the judge made. And then shortly thereafter, there was a second decision by another judge, which decided that I would lose custody of my son, and that I would have to pay child support in a dollar value of about 80 to 90% of my salary. And this is also a violation of the Hague Convention, Article 16, because it was, I appealed, and it was before the final decision to whether or not to send my son home or not was made. But ultimately, a final decision was made. My son wasn't sent home. I started a new Hague process based on Article 21, rights of access. And that went on for years. And there's lots of legal problems. So it's, the Hague process didn't work for me. And what I know now, what I didn't know in the beginning, is this has to do with corruption at the highest levels. It's in the Nicaraguan Supreme Court. I know who's involved. So I had no way of winning any case in Nicaragua. This was right. It was the president of the Supreme Court and her legal advisor, my ex-wife, had managed to get a way in there. So I didn't get my son back. I have had very little contact with him, but last year, all of a sudden, my ex-wife was arrested in Germany. She was extradited to Norway. She was put on trial for child abduction. She was found guilty and was sentenced to 15 months in prison. So although she won the civil aspects of, in terms of the Hague Convention, her criminal deeds caught up with her. She's in Norway now, as is my son. She is still not in prison. It's pending appeal, so she's still out there, and they're living together. My son doesn't want to have anything to do with me. He is completely on her side, and that's the impact of years of intense control over him. So far, not a happy ending. So that's my situation, and I spoke to a lot of parents, and the similarities are eerie. And I'm looking at this from not an American point of view, but from a Norwegian point of view, and an insight. I work in the Norwegian Foreign Service. I was very cocky to begin with, because I thought, you know, I'm part of the system. It's going to work for me. I have colleagues working in consular affairs, but guess what? It didn't work for me either. And I have the same complaints and same frustrations that I hear that my American friends have, and friends in other countries. But I thought I would just mention, don't have much time here, but I listened in on the session with Bart Kritzer, and he mentioned the toolbox idea, and that's also my way of thinking. And so, what tools do we have in terms of dealing with these abduction cases? And that's exactly my mindset, and that's exactly the term that I've had in my head for a long time. What tools do we have? Because there's no single way out of here. And I've spent a lot of time thinking back over the years. You know, could I have done something better? Could I have used? Are the tools that I didn't use well enough? And the tools in the toolkits that I used, I mean, it was the Hague Convention, the Hague process, both in terms of trying to have my son returned, but also in terms of getting rights of access. I worked with the central authorities in both countries, in Nicaragua and Norway. I was in constant contact with them. I tried to engage Norwegian politicians. I didn't have the same success that you had, Noel. They have a slightly different system in Norway, so they don't have the constituency system. But you know, I worked on that. I contacted Nicaraguan politicians, the family minister. The Nicaraguan foreign minister was in Norway at one point. I showed up at his hotel. I gave him a heartfelt letter. I worked the press. I tried to, at least. I've been to newspaper articles. I was on television in Nicaragua a number of times. I worked on the family and friends of my ex-wife. All of them pretty much were on my side, except for her mother. Her sister helped me quite a bit. So that's part of the toolkit. Reunite International is a charity organization based in England that carries out mediation services. I was in contact with them, attempted mediation. That didn't work. And the problem is that a lot of people who abduct their children, they do have sociopathic tendencies, and getting them in mediation is quite often is not very effective. I worked as liaison judges, both in Norway and Nicaragua, and the communication between them was horrible. I worked with psychologists. I contacted the Nicaraguan Human Rights Office. So I'm mentioning all this because these are all tools that I tried to use. And they may have been effective hadn't it been for the fact that I was fighting a corrupt situation. I mean, I was going to lose no matter what. But there's one tool in this toolbox that I've noticed doesn't get talked about very often, and it's something that I look back on and I think that maybe I could have worked a little bit more with, and that's Henrik's school. Henrik was put in the American Nicaraguan school, initially in secret, and they wouldn't tell me anything that he was there or not. His mother instructed them not to give me any information. And he was there for a lot, and I protested, and I never reached a point where they would provide me information, and I pretty much gave up after a while. But the school is important. The school is an arena where this abducted child does not have total control of the parent. It's sort of a weak spot in this protective armor that the abductor is trying to shield the child against the parent. So if you can establish some sort of line of communication with the school, you may be able to get a channel of communication with your child. I did to a certain extent at the American Nicaraguan school, but I was not very successful. But another important thing about the school is that they can, if they understand the situation and they understand the pressure your child is under, they can monitor the situation and they can keep an eye on the child. They can look out for behavioral problems. If they're a little bit older, if there's indications of substance abuse or depression, I don't know, suicidal thoughts, but they need to be made aware of this. And another thing about the schools I've thought a lot about is they can either prevent or they can promote parental alienation against the remaining parent. And I feel in my case, the American Nicaraguan school very much promoted the alienation that my son now holds against me, because my son could see that his school would not communicate with me. His teachers refused to speak with me. I was not allowed to attend school events. I didn't have access to his grades. He could see who held the power. It was his mother. And that's a powerful force after years of watching that there's something wrong with dad. Even his school won't talk with him. So I probably spoken more than my allotted time, but just to throw out there, just don't forget about the schools. That may be, and schools are different. My school is a private school, and there are public schools in different types of countries. I'm certain a public school in a rural area in Zimbabwe is completely different from the school my son went to. But it's worth keeping in the back of your head, in your toolkit. So I'm thinking at an individual level, if you can, to the extent you can, try to keep contact with teachers or the principal, or the counselors, or somebody at the school, and try to communicate in a non-confrontational way, in a manner that's not threatening, and make sure that they understand you're not trying to drag them into a domestic conflict, and try to get them to understand that they also have a responsibility for the welfare of the child. The American Nicaraguan school kept telling me that that's none of our business. We don't want to get involved. It's a domestic. No, I'm sorry. You are involved. I am sorry. You are deeply involved when you leave my son in your school. So I sort of think of following up this on an individual level. I've thought sort of an organizational level. If there was, because I felt very alone in communicating with this school. If I could get backup from someone somehow. And I've thought, is there a role for ISTAN or Department of Education in terms of sending, I don't know, an information packet about child abduction, about parental alienation, about what's going on with the child, to sort of educate these educators? Because my experience, these are intelligent people with master's degrees. They clearly didn't understand what was going on in terms with my son. And then at a systemic level, is there something more we can do? It's occurred to me, I mean, this Hague Convention on Child Abduction is ripe for being renegotiated and made more effective. And one of the things you could do, potentially, you could stick it into Article 21, which is rights of access. And also parents, if it's deemed that the child is not to be returned to the country the child came from, that at least both parents, the remaining parent, that country has an obligation to make sure that that parent has information from the school. I feel that, just to conclude, that if I had managed to have a better communication with the school, if they'd let me in and treated me as a father, and my son could have seen over these years that I was interested in him, I was following him, I was active in his schools, maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't have been as alienated as he is now. So toolbox, a really interesting concept. I think working with the schools is one tool that maybe we should think a little bit more about working with. Thank you.
Thank you, Ralph.
You want me there? I have a mic to this mic. Okay, I do have some notes though, so I'll refer to. Hello, everybody. My name is Paul Toland. I retired from the Navy last year after 30 years as a Navy Medical Service Corps officer. But in addition to that, I'm the only living parent to Erica Toland. She was abducted 17 years ago, so I think I'm probably just close to the oldest case because she was 9 months old at the time, and she turns 18 on the 17th of this month. So, and she's wrongfully retained right now in Japan by her grandmother because my wife passed away in 2007. So over the last 17 years, I want to talk to you. I'm going to talk a little bit more than talk about my own case. I'm going to talk more about COVID-19, and you might have got a little preview of some of the things I've been looking at when I was talking to the OCI director this morning. But over the last 17 years, I've witnessed a great deal of injustices perpetrated both by our own government here in the US and by foreign governments in erecting barriers to our access to our children and to getting our children returned. Under normal circumstances, those barriers are very significant, from justice systems that don't have any enforcement to access that's purely voluntary and subject to the abducting parents' whims. But in addition to all those normal barriers that most of us have already experienced, our own government and foreign governments can take advantage of emergency situations, such as natural disasters, to set up additional barriers in accessing our children. The ongoing global crisis of COVID-19 is but the latest in a long line of crises that our government has used as an excuse to set up these barriers. So before specifically talking about COVID-19, I'll give you one example from my own experience, and I think I've told Noelle and Randy this example of a past natural disaster. My daughter, Erica, is abducted to Japan. So after the earthquake and tsunami in 2011, the US government set up a special hotline for Americans to find out the status of any American citizen relatives that might be in Japan. Where are they? Are they okay? So, of course, we had a very, very tight network of parents who had children abducted to Japan, and the word got around, and we're like, hey, you know, they know where many of our children are, but they won't tell us. This is a way to find out where our children are. And not only that, but did they survive the earthquake and tsunami? So we started using that number. And initially, like 1 or 2 parents had success. And then all of a sudden, State Department shut us down. They said, whoa, 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 we don't want you finding out where your children are. We want you, and they told, they gave a list of names to the people who ran that 1-800 number of who we were, and said to redirect us back to OCI. So we couldn't find out. We could find out the status of our children. OCI would then go look and come back and contact and tell us then, oh yeah, your kid's okay, and that's all we can tell you. But we couldn't find out where they were. So we were basically treated as a different class of citizen than everybody else. So that's a concrete example of how they used, our own government used a natural disaster to set up barriers that don't exist for other Americans, and to treat us as a different class of citizen, simply because we're the victims of a crime. So we were not allowed to use that phone hotline anymore. So when Noelle asked me to come speak, I thought, well, let me go out and do some research and find out if they're using COVID-19 like that, and what kind of examples people actually have of this, and of barriers to getting our children. And I went out and polled parents through Facebook and email to see what kind of barriers they've had. And I found that there were additional barriers, some inherent due to the nature of a global pandemic that just simply couldn't be helped, and some specifically perpetrated by foreign governments. And I didn't find a ton on our own government as much as, but definitely by foreign governments. And some of my general findings were the State Department and other countries use COVID as a reason to slow things down, as if they weren't slow enough, and not take any action. Say, well, we can't really do anything. COVID. Sorry, we can't help the COVID. Some of that's understandable. They were shifted into working probably from home and things like that, and trying to adapt to that. But another generality that I found is access to other countries is now harder. So the ability to locate, recover, and gain access to your children is harder. Court dates, both within the US and overseas, have been postponed or canceled altogether, which creates delays in getting court orders, access, enforcement, or other legal mechanisms necessary to implement the return of your children. And finally, the other generality that I found is that if there's existing visitation or access to your child, it's very likely being interfered with by the abducting parent using COVID as a reason. So it's an easy out. Sorry, can't let you see a child. COVID, too dangerous. Now, I got a few specific anecdotal cases that people sent me. of their own cases. And here's a couple interesting ones. One individual from Korea, so he's a Korean national, he was undergoing mediation in Tachikawa court in Japan because his child is in Japan. The mediator said, well, since he had to travel to get to court, he was too dangerous to meet with his abducted son. So the individual said he'll come, stay in Japan, and quarantine himself in Japan. And he did. He came to Japan, quarantined himself at a guest house in Tokyo. But the court said it's still too dangerous since he's staying at a guest house. So he's told by the court, for the sake of the child, to go home and to not be selfish, and that he should return to Korea and come back once COVID is over. And the real travesty is that that child's grandparents, who live in the same household as the child, they go back and forth to work every day. Court had no problem with that. But this individual was quarantining himself, and the court said, don't be selfish, go back home to Korea. So you can imagine that's the kind of stuff going on. You know, another one, and I'm sure there's lots of these out there. An individual told me he had been able to see his son somewhat regularly before COVID happened. But once it happened, the inducting mother canceled all visitations indefinitely. He petitioned the court, but no avail. I think that's pretty widespread, that kind of thing with COVID. Another one was a Canadian father contacted me, said, as you can imagine, communication via their government has slowed to a near standstill. Many parents rely on communication and status of their abducted children to occur from their government, and this individual basically is getting no information at all on his child. And I can imagine that might be happening in the US as well, but this was a Canadian case that contacted me. Another interesting one, it's one of the Facebook pages I'm on, about many Japan-related Facebook pages right now. Many parents who I know who are Japanese legal residents, so they live in Japan legally, because they decided to, because they might have some small modicum of access to their child. So they said, I'm giving up everything and I'm gonna live in Japan so I can be near my child. Maybe I get to see the child once a month, maybe once every 6 months, but I'm gonna try to be near my child. They are now encountering a problem because when Japan shut down, they implemented a foreign resident re-entry ban. Now, this doesn't apply to Japanese citizens, but to foreign residents who live in Japan. If they leave Japan for any reason, they can't get back in. So maybe they have a relative who died or is very sick, and then they have to make the hard choice. Do I go back home to visit my sick, dying mother and possibly not be able to get back into Japan to see my child? Or do I stay in Japan and not get to see my sick and dying mother before she dies? So those are the choices that people are having to make with COVID. Now, I do understand, specifically with Japan, this was an issue when I researched it a month ago. They have started gradual reopening as they're adapting to it. So I think that particular one is starting to get better. So in addition to that, some of what you heard me talk to the OCI director about is how courts are grappling with how to balance Hague returns with safety during COVID-19. And The Hague, as I mentioned this morning, has this 2-page document called a Toolkit for 1980 Child Abduction Convention in the Times of COVID-19. It's a rather weak document, very non-specific information, as is The Hague itself. But they're trying to promote some of the following. Trying to promote online and remote mediation. They're trying to harness information, electronic and communications technology to ensure convention cases advance through resolution. Some of the things they're trying to promote, and when I say they're trying to promote it, I don't know how they're trying to promote it. Maybe through this meeting that the OCI director said was taking place later today. I don't know, but electronic authentication and filing of documents, virtual or hybrid hearings, taking of evidence by electronic means. They're trying to safeguard equality between parties in convention cases, ensuring equal participation and access to technology and resources. I think, in other words, they're encouraging moving many Hague processes to electronic technology formats, but in many countries, in many areas throughout the world, a parent may not have access to that technology. So if you're moving something to online and using technology, maybe the parent is out of luck because they don't have access to technology. So The Hague's trying to promote that all parents get access to that. And then there's a few other things, you know, where at the State Department and Justice level of working and communicating among members of the judiciary across borders through judicial communications or through the International Hague Network of Judges. So those are some of the measures that this two-page document encourages relating to court processes. Then there is the process of actually returning a child safely during COVID, which we also talked about a little bit this morning, so I don't want to be too redundant, but the main thing here is to try to ensure a smooth execution of return orders during all the restrictions and stuff of COVID, putting practical arrangements in place that ensure door-to-door safe return of the child, and safe, not just regular safe, but safe in terms of COVID. Placement of child on flight priority lists, purchase of medical and travel insurance in the case of COVID-19 infection, and where necessary, self-isolation at the destination the child's going to. And excuse me, and consider and address potential parent and child anxiety with regard to travel in light of COVID-19, especially in situations where the parent cannot travel with the child. So this is the last point I have. In addition to the Hague Toolkit, and I mentioned this morning too, it's been determined that the grave risk exception has increased in Hague cases during COVID-19. Like I said, I saw a journal article on that. I'm not a lawyer, so I didn't get too deeply into the situation. As Mr. Renner, the OCI director, said this morning, he knows that is happening, but he doesn't know if there's been any cases that have actually won using that defense, that, hey, it's a grave risk to the child to travel from New Zealand to Texas because New Zealand has no cases and Texas or Florida have a lot of cases. He doesn't know of anybody that's won based on that, but it'd be worth looking into. And as you know, the grave risk exception is that the person is not exposed to any physical or psychological danger of being placed in an intolerable situation. So I know that the people are using that grave risk exception for using COVID as a grave risk. Like I said, I don't know if those have merits or not, but I just think it's important that we be aware of that. So COVID-19 has significant impact on the already tragic and painful issue of international child abduction and compounds the difficulty in many additional ways. And there's no easy answers at this time, but just the understanding of the issues I laid out is a first step toward figuring out how to implement solutions to that. So that's all I got.
Paul, Eugene, and Alf. I'd like to just recap some of the obstacles that you all presented in your discussion, and then shift our balance of time. And I want to leave time for a few questions if we have it, or if we have, for the opportunities, because that's how we want to end. The obstacles are formidable, but not overcomable, I don't think. So some of the obstacles that I heard from you gentlemen, and I actually had a question on the first one. This is kind of rhetorical for right now. What if the FBI declines to take up a case? I think there are parents in this room who, for various reasons, the FBI has declined. And so how do we turn that obstacle into an opportunity? I know at least two parents in this room, speaking of child support and exorbitant child support, are spending their very existence is tied up in their cases, not just their emotional well-being, but their financial well-being as well. And so child support, even though there are laws and even Hague Protocol regarding it, is still a formidable barrier for our children. I heard you all talking about the injustice and barriers that are present in both foreign and domestic courts. And I think we heard some of that earlier today as well. The rules change, as Paul indicated, regarding a situation in which evacuation or repatriation or contact and welfare whereabouts checks about American citizens, except for children who are unlawfully held in countries. Certainly, COVID has become an excuse and a barrier for some nations as to why their courts aren't functioning, or the delays are profound. And then Paul mentioned a new emerging barrier for us is the grave risk exception as it relates to COVID-19. So before we move to opportunities, I'd like to give any of our panelists an opportunity to respond to those obstacles and potential for overcoming them, if any of those were salient to you.
Yeah, I would say if the FBI is not taking your case, I highly recommend you try what I said in my short presentation is then the FBI has to work closely with a federal prosecutor. So if the FBI is not engaging, you can try the other way, which is go to the U.S. Attorney's Office, Department of Justice, and see if you can get a federal prosecutor to take the case. And that prosecutor will get an FBI agent assigned to the case. If neither one of those work, then like I said, I would go to your congressional representatives and put pressure on the DOJ and the FBI. And then let me give you another example. What happened? You know, some of you may know Bob Pfeiffer and his son Jerry in that story.
Yeah.
But Bob actually showed up at my office at the U.S. Embassy when I was working in Paris. And he didn't understand the system. There was no FBI open case where he lived in California, and he had a California arrest warrant and wanted me to go arrest this the mother in France. And there were several problems because she wasn't in France, and a California arrest warrant is no good in France. So I had to explain a few things to Bob, and we worked it out. And I love this idea of having a toolkit and thinking outside the box. And what I recommend is a couple of things I thought of while I was listening to Alf about schools is you can use Interpol red notices to your advantage too. And you can do that through the FBI agent assigned to your case. Another thing that Bob Pfeiffer did that was excellent is he initiated an entire social media campaign. And it was a tip through that social media campaign where we found his son in Slovenia. Or maybe it was Slovakia, I can't remember right now, but it was one of those two countries. So his social media campaign was phenomenal. The other thing with Bob is Bob and I talked for months. We brainstormed ideas together. So if you do have an FBI agent, brainstorm with that agent and think of ideas. And one thing I did on a case when I was also assigned to the Philippines once, and I worked a parental kidnapping matter, and there was no dual criminality in the Philippines. It's not against the law there is no parental kidnapping crime in the Philippines. So what we did was a little inventive outside the box. I worked with my State Department colleagues, and we canceled the abducting parent's passport. So now he was in the Philippines, but he no longer had valid status. And based on that, the Filipinos let me arrest him and bring him back to the nearest federal judge, which was in Guam. I put him on a plane and I flew him to Guam. So there's ways to think outside the box, and you can brainstorm with your investigators.
Thank you, Eugene. Other thoughts from Alf or Paul on those obstacles that we restated there?
Yeah, I think if I could just mention, Noel, you mentioned the child support, and as I mentioned, you know, this crazy court decision where I have to pay close to 90% of my salary, and it's an illegal decision in terms of Nicaraguan law, which says that 25% of your salary is the maximum, but the judge ruled that way. And I appealed, and I lost and appealed all the way to the Supreme Court of Nicaragua. But right now, there's another Hague Convention. We talked about the Hague Convention on Child Abduction. There's another Hague Convention. There's a Hague Convention on International Recovery of Child Support and other forms of family maintenance. That one's really spooky. And I mentioned it a little bit in my little article, but since I wrote the article, my ex-wife and my alienated son are moving ahead with this. So I have gotten a letter from the Norwegian Central Authority for the Child Support Hague Convention, that they are now considering making that decision legal in Norway and making me pay that money 7 years after the fact. Nicaragua became a member of that convention in April this year, and they're going 7 years backwards in time. And the Child Abduction Convention, parties to the convention have to accept each other as partners. The Child Support Convention doesn't work that way. It's only if a convention a member state raises an objection. So Nicaragua, Kazakhstan, Honduras, Guyana, Burkina Faso are countries that have acceded to this Hague Convention, where other parties are then obligated to enforce court decisions on child support without even looking at the substance of the decision. Child support is important, so anybody in that situation with an adopted child, be careful with regards to what's going on with regard to child support.
Paul, any comments?
Oh,
All righty, and thank you. So in the balance of our time, let's talk about opportunities. And there are opportunities, even though in this, I would certainly take questions in just one moment. So I just wanted to restate some of the opportunities that you may have heard. We've heard references to the toolkit or toolboxes several times today. And once you hear something once, okay, twice, maybe. 3 or more times, we need to act on it. And so this is certainly for us here. We have an opportunity to fill this toolbox with some of the pragmatic suggestions that have occurred in this session and other ones as well. We heard about another opportunity is Reunite. I saw some heads shaking in this room when Reunite, that organizations in the nations where our children are held, or our organizations that work with those nations to try to resolve and return our children. American schools, both an obstacle and an opportunity, as I heard Alf say. So they really have, they can be an impediment and magnify alienation, or they can make a better decision in favor of the child as they would with other parents, and include those parents in the school notifications and report cards. And by those pragmatic steps, they can get a sense of who the other parent actually is and allow them to be a part of their children's lives in that sense, and not be complicit. The process, as Eugene spoke about in terms of The Hague and working with organizations and institutions, processes can work. And he gave us some suggestions. If the process doesn't work at step 1, this is what you do at step 2 and step 3. And there's resilience built into what he's saying, in that we don't give up when we get the door slammed or get a non-committal response. I also heard the opportunities to use technology to our advantage. And certainly we're doing that now by live streaming. And, there are opportunities to use technology, both for communicating with our children, but then also new ways to communicate with those institutions that have a stake in returning our children. And then the final one that I heard, I think Paul said this, but I can't remember, but it's about understanding, getting a clear understanding of what the obstacles and the opportunities are, and using those to our advantage. So I just wanted to open the floor. We've got about 5 or 10 minutes for questions. Are any questions from the audience? John, and I'll repeat the question for our panelists.
Yeah, I've got the microphone, so hopefully you can hear me. My question is for Eugene, Agent Casey. I don't know how you prefer to be addressed.
Eugene is fine.
Okay, your slides are excellent. Under the Hague Convention, in a country where an arrest warrant has been issued here, the threat of arrest constitutes a Hague exception in the current judicial guidance. So if my FBI agent or AUSA issues that arrest warrant or a red notice, then I can lose in court. How can I ensure that these things exist? And maybe the warrant is sealed, maybe the FBI is withholding those notices pending the results of the trial or the hearing. Basically, how can I confirm that the AUSA has taken up my case beyond my FBI agent saying there's a plan in motion?
Good question. I'm not sure I have a good answer for you, but the way it works is it's actually the U.S. Department of Justice requests the equivalent ministry in the other country to issue a provisional arrest warrant, a local arrest warrant. And they don't normally share that with the FBI or the DOJ. We'll never see that warrant because it's not valid in our jurisdiction. So they will have it, and it's up to them, when they're going to execute it. And quite frankly, a lot of that pressure comes from the FBI attaché in that country, the Legat office, the relationships they have with their counterparts to make the local police go and arrest and execute that warrant. And that's why we're there. That's why the FBI is overseas, to have those personal relationships and make those things happen. So I think your FBI agent is right. If he says it's happening, it's happening. And it does take time for the DOJ to request another country to come up with an arrest warrant, that process alone could take months. Then from the arrest warrant being issued to it being acted upon, that could be days, weeks. I mean, it depends how easy they are to find too. And if they're using their true name and living in a place that's easy to find, I mean, there could be all kinds of obstacles. But did I answer your question, or is there?
You
Not
did,
really.
but if I might follow up, let's say that the abducting parent leaves the country and travels. If
Yeah.
I can't see the red notice because it's not listed publicly on Interpol, can an officer in another country, not the FBI, recognize this person as wanted by the FBI?
Yes, well, there's a lot of misinformation about Interpol and red notices.
Yes.
There are no Interpol police. They don't arrest anyone. It's just an information sharing system. So when we say we want to arrest such and such a fugitive based on unlawful flight to avoid prosecution or some other type of matter, we submit that to Interpol, and we don't want them to make it public, because then if the person finds out they're wanted, they may not travel, and then we won't be able to catch them. So it's kind of behind the scenes, a lot of those red notices. So we're hoping, that the person we're trying to get travels to a country that has an extradition treaty with the United States. And if that happens, even in most countries, no one honors an Interpol arrest warrant to actually arrest anyone. In some countries, they may detain them for several hours. In some countries, they'll just notify you that they passed through immigration. They won't even hold them. So if the FBI, if we get notified by Interpol, okay, this person arrived in country X, we try to get a provisional arrest warrant in that country as soon as possible. And some countries give us a 6-hour window to do that, and some countries don't. So it's very country specific on how that process works and how effective it is. And for someone like me who's had fugitives over 21 years, I only had someone successfully arrested by an Interpol red notice and extradited once. And I had many, many fugitives, international fugitives throughout my career. So it's a tool in the toolkit, but I wouldn't ever depend on an Interpol red notice resulting in something satisfactory.
Thank you.
I thank you for that last comment and leading back to our opportunity for understanding how systems work and having a realism approach to pursuing our cases. That's a tidbit for the toolkit for sure. Most of us think that there is an Interpol police, and that if there's a red notice, bam, it's just a matter of time, and we certainly know that's not the case. I want to take an opportunity to thank Paul Tolan from Bring Abducted Children Home, our good friend Eugene Casey, our fellow parent Al Friso. Eugene, I will share, if you are fine, I will share the slides with everyone here at the conference. Great. Alf, your article again is in their folder, and we're also going to make that available to conference participants and on our website. Paul, thank you so much for coming from Hawaii. I know you had some other business, but you took it upon yourself to come and be a part of this movement that you have been in and leading well before we came along. And so I honor that. And so just in closing, as we close out this portion of the International Parents Conference, I'd like to again thank our panelists. I'd like to thank the Preston Family Foundation for their generous support to make iSTAND 2020 a beautiful reality. Thank you to our fellow parent, Zuber Faruqi, for his excellent live streaming. I've gotten lots of comments on Facebook and in my text messages. People have tuned in, and so thank you for making this happen for us. We appreciate you. Thank you so much to all of the parents and families who sacrificed yourself, your resources, your time, even putting yourself at risk because we're in a pandemic. You came to iSTAND 2020 in a pandemic. And if that's not commitment, there is none. And so we honor that, and we'll just continue to shoulder on. Thank you for those of you who tuned in through the live stream community, and we hope to bring you more events like this, not just at our annual conference, but it's time for us to take back all parts of this movement, and that means take back the technology that's a part of it and use it for our advantage. And I'd like to just invite you to join us for iStand 2021. Thank you all.
Thank you, Noel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.